Professor Cevik, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. To what extent does the arrest of Ekrem Imamoglu represent a definitive rupture in Turkey's transition from competitive authoritarianism to full-fledged autocracy?
Well, thank you for inviting me. And for the question, I think it is a major big threshold. So far, well, to be honest, Ekrem İmamoğlu is not the first politician to be arrested in Turkey. Turkey has been on an authoritarian trajectory for more than a decade, which involved the imprisonment of many politicians. Particularly people from the Kurdish political movement have been arrested en masse. Some are still behind the bars, among them the most prominently Selahattin Demirtas, who is still in prison for more than 8 years. So in that sense, İmamoğlu's arrest is nothing new in Turkey. But it is new in the sense that it is aiming to destroy the competitive element of the political regime. When we talk about competitive authoritarianism, it is an authoritarian system anyway. But what distinguishes it from full authoritarian regimes and competitive authoritarian regimes is that in competitive authoritarianism, there is a realistic possibility that opposition can win in the election. Now, why is İmamoğlu being arrested and not anyone else? And I think there is a clear answer to that. He is the most potent rival of Erdogan. He is arrested because he will potentially defeat Erdogan in the next elections. Now, if you put people who will win the elections behind the bars, that by definition undermines competitive dimension of competitive authoritarianism, because if you arrest whoever going to win, then it's no longer competitive, and then it becomes a full authoritarian system. So in that sense, I think we've crossed the biggest threshold from competitive authoritarianism to full authoritarianism.
Right. How has Erdogan's brand of populism evolved into an instrument of authoritarian consolidation? And how central is the creation of internal enemies to this strategy?
Populism and the creation of internal enemies is very central to Erdogan's authoritarianism. Over the years, that has been actually, even when he was not a fully autocratic leader, when Turkey's democracy was going relatively well, Erdogan has always used that populist strategy for mobilization. And he has been ruling now for more than 2 decades. The first decade has been relatively democratic or acceptably democratic, initially even pro-democratic. And starting from his second term, second decade in power, he started to become more and more authoritarian. But over this more than 20 years, he always created some internal enemies. And that internal enemy actually changed over time. It was Kemalists, Gülenists, Kurds, Turkish nationalists. At different stages of his political career, he created different internal enemies. And he managed to establish a minimum winning coalition to defeat, quote unquote, defeat that internal enemy. So that's his political style and strategy. In that sense, populism is very integral to the establishment of authoritarianism in Turkey. But when we talk about this recent event, this arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu and that Turkey crossing a threshold from competitive to full authoritarianism, I don't think populism is the right term here. Because populism, like by definition, is about being popular. It's about remaining. The populist autocrats usually mobilize the majority around themselves, and they create the internal enemies just to create this minimum winning coalition, at least, or to configure a majority. They create the internal enemy. That has been Erdogan's tactic for more than 20 years. But as I said in the previous question, now we are crossing a threshold of competitive to full authoritarianism, which means that, I mean, Erdogan has been a popular politician, and he has always been a very popular politician. He always managed to create a winning majority, a coalition of minimum winning majority. He's crossing that threshold because he believes and he sees that he can no longer do that. He's no longer the popular figure. He no longer has 51% behind his side. So and that's why he is crossing that threshold. So I think populist mobilization is no longer the key term to understand Turkish authoritarianism. Of course, the process that I'm talking about has just started, and we don't know where it will go. But if everything goes by Erdogan's expectation, he no longer and if Turkey is no longer a competitor but a full authoritarian regime, he no longer need to be popular. It will not be a majority authoritarian regime. It will be an authoritarian regime ruled by a minority. And that means he will be ruling by force rather than creating a consent of the majority by populist means. But as I said, this is just at the beginning of the process. But where we are heading is that populism is no longer the fundamental strategy. Force is the fundamental strategy of Erdogan.
Right. Would you characterize the current crisis as the culmination of a long-standing populist logic that inherently undermines liberal democratic norms?
Yes, I mean, this populist strategy that Erdogan has pursued so far has enabled him to come to this place. It has enabled him to dismantle rule of law. It has enabled him to undermine political liberties. It has enabled him to the point that he could create miseries for individual people, for groups that he selects, for his internal enemies. But as I said in the previous question, that internal enemies are no longer the minority. Now he is creating an internal enemy that will probably at the end of this process be the majority. So it will be a forceful authoritarianism. But it was populism and populist dismantling of rule of law and the liberal protection that comes with it that has brought us to this point, that has enabled Erdogan to cross this threshold that we are talking about now.
Right. In what ways has the personalization of power under Erdogan blurred institutional lines between the state party and the judiciary?
Well, in very fundamental ways. I mean, when Erdogan came to power, AK Party was a cadre movement. It had a number two, Abdullah Gül, number three, Bülent Arınç. Some would call Abdüllatif Şener as number four, and the list would go. We had a powerful cabinet with very prominent politicians and etc. So it was a cadre movement. Now there is no number two within AK Party, let alone number three or a cadre, and the ministers doesn't mean anything anymore. Even in this current crisis, we see that Erdogan is in a way defending himself. He has no more credible political allies to defend him. So everything is personalized in Turkey. But it first started with the personalization of power within AK Party. So Erdogan first hijacked the party. It was a party of prominent figures. It was a cadre movement. It had a political ideology, or at least a claim to a conservative democracy, and etc. But step by step, he personalized the power within the party. He sidelined all important political figures, and he removed this political substance of the party. And when we talk about AK Party's ideology or political beliefs, we can no longer speak about anything because, as I've said, over the 20 years, he kept on shifting his coalitions, that there's no ideological substance left as well. So party became Erdogan. And from after that, he personalized other cores of power. He personalized the judiciary. The party started to control the state, and by definition, since party is Erdogan, he started to bring the judiciary, bring the media, and bring the business community and civil society under the party's control, which then by definition became Erdogan's control. So at the end of the day, and with the switch to the presidential system, which in a way formalized all these informal power configurations. I mean, the regime was very much formalized around 2013-14 already. But with the switch to presidential system, he formalized that personalization. And now we are talking about a single individual ruling over not only executive, but judiciary and parliament and civil society and all segments of power.
Right. Is the recent political crackdown a sign of regime insecurity ahead of elections, or a calculated strategy to establish post-electoral authoritarian permanence?
I think it is both a symptom of weakness and strength at the same time. It's a symptom of weakness because Erdogan is very weak in sense of his popular support. So far, what made Erdogan so indispensable for all his allies is that he brought the majority of the public with him. He one way or another. I mean, we could criticize the tactics he have been using for remaining popular, but at the end of the day, he managed to remain popular. That's no longer the case. That's no longer the case for the last few years. There is Erdogan. The people in Turkey who doesn't want to see him as president are a bigger coalition than people who wants to see him as the president. This was actually the case even 2 years ago in the previous election, but he survived by using tactics. He survived by dividing the opposition. He survived by making sure that opposition would promote a candidate, Kılıçdaroğlu, who would be unable to unite the opposition. And at the time, he also used judicial tactics. There was a court case against Imamoglu back then as well. So, and he used other instruments as well. He prevented that the opposition could unite behind one person. But he no longer can do that. The local elections showed that CHP is the main actor within the opposition, and CHP itself can create a majority bigger than Erdogan can. So in that sense, he's very weak in terms of popular legitimacy. And that's in a way pushing him to take this measure. But on the other hand, he's very powerful because he rules the state, he rules the coercive apparatus, he rules the judiciary, he controls the media. And the international context, maybe you would ask this later, but let me say it very briefly. The international context also emboldened him so much. He knows that America is on his side. He knows that for a variety of reasons, Europe will be silent. So he's very powerful in that sense. So it's a combination of being powerful in the sense that he can do, but he's very weak because he has to do, because he couldn't just let the competitive authoritarian, he couldn't just let the game as it is and risk an election, however unfair it would be, that he would lose. So he has to take the measures to prevent that. So in a way, he can and he has to take these steps because he's very strong in certain sense, but he's very weak in terms of popular legitimacy.
Right. Has political Islamism in Turkey under the AKP shifted from a reformist ethos to a mechanism of ideological legitimation for autocracy? Do you see the regime's increasing reliance on religious nationalist rhetoric as signaling a radicalization or merely instrumental populist recalibration?
Well, as you mentioned in the question, political Islam in early 2000s had gained a reformist character. Back at the time, they denied that they were Islamists. The famous claim is that they switched the shirts and they labeled themselves as conservative Democrats. But that was merely a name change because that was the only way to avoid Turkey's stringent secularist laws. In Turkey, unlike in Europe, you can't have a Muslim Democratic Party. You have to use the label conservative, whereas the whole public understands that when you say conservative, you are basically referring to Islam and religion. So as a conservative Democratic Party in his early years, AK Party was indeed a reformist movement. And it carried, I have to say that in those years, the religious understanding in society also became more pluralistic and democratic in the process of the Kulturkampf in Turkey between the authoritarian secularists and the conservative majority. So in order to defeat or in order to undermine the authoritarian secularist powers who were in minority, Islam had gained, or Islamist has gained a popular and gained a language of democratization, and they pushed for reformism in the system. But once that's basically around 2010 to 2012, 13. It's not easy to determine a single date, but once Erdogan became clear that he is no longer under threat, he no longer had to use this reformist agenda, and then the entire logic has switched, and Islam became an instrument of authoritarianism to justify his again populist, majoritarian, but also very authoritarian moves. But for the second half of your question, I don't think we are seeing any radicalization. Radicalization implies a change of the political regime itself towards a more religious understanding, if I don't misunderstand the question. I don't see that coming, and it never came over the last decade. I mean, Erdogan piled up his power, but never actually used it to change the system into a more Islamic way, in the sense of changing the legal system or giving religion more power in instrumenting in his execution. I mean, the only time he actually made a reference to Quran is when he lowered interest rates, which was a stupid idea, and stupid in the sense that it was against economic orthodoxy, but it was also stupid in the sense that religion doesn't really provide any justification for it. Religion doesn't prohibit high interest rates. I mean, it prohibits interest. So if he said that I want to remove interest from Turkey's political system because religion says so, then yes, we can talk about a religious ruled country where religious dictates the laws. That would be a clear sign that Turkey abandons secular governance towards a more Islamic governance. But what he said was, and I think I find this very illuminating, he didn't say we don't want interest. He said, I'm lowering the interest rates because Islam doesn't like interest. So at that moment, it's very clear that religion is being instrumentalized for a policy. He wanted to push low interest rates for a set of policy reasons we don't need to discuss at the moment. But he used religion to justify it. So it's pretty much an instrumentalization of religion. He didn't abolish the system. He didn't change the rules of the game towards a more religious thing. Religion was merely a pawn. And I see no reason why that would change soon.
Right. To what degree does the AKP's Islamic narrative still resonate with its core electorate, particularly in light of economic hardship and rising dissent?
It's difficult to answer a yes and no question to here. I mean, on the one hand, obviously he commands some popularity. I said that he lost the majority and he will probably never recover that majority, but he commands the support of, I don't know, 30, 40, 45%. I can't have the numbers. And some of that support comes for religious reasons. Certain segments of the society consider him as a religious person. More so, they hate the seculars so much that they align around Erdogan, who they believe as a bulwark against between seculars and themselves. So some part of his popularity still relies on religion. But on the other hand, obviously that popularity is declining, and that decline has everything to do with economic hardship. Uh, economy itself wouldn't be sufficient to create that majority, but it would be powerful. It would be enough to destroy Erdogan's majority. So, or let me phrase it this way. So far, Erdogan was both a provider economically and a protector religiously. He claimed to protect the religious values and also be providing economically. So that was his success in maintaining that majority. If he loses in one of them, that majority would go. He sticks to the religious argument, but he's losing the provider argument, the economic argument. So that majority is declining. But so as I said, it's a gray area. Religion is still a powerful instrumental tool for him, but in case of an economic hardship, it won't be enough.
Right. How do the current mass protests compare to 2013 Gezi Park movement in terms of mobilization dynamics, ideological coherence, and regime response? Could the protests catalyze a broader democratic awakening, or will they be contained through increased repression and securitization?
Let me start with the second half. I don't know. I mean, it can if the mobilization goes on and if they can force Erdogan to back down, it could be the start of a new democratization era in Turkey. It is possible but unlikely. The more likely scenario would be Erdogan to suppress the current mobilization and switch the system to an ever more authoritarian system. But still, it's a process on the making. We can't know. But if to compare it with the Gezi Park protests, I think one major difference is that, as just in the previous question, we talked about economy. When the Gezi Park protests erupted, it was more of a middle class people being bothered by Erdogan's increasing personalization of power, his basically his attitude of I am the ruler of this country and I don't care about what you think. Everything is what I say. It was a more what political scientists call as a tutelar type of regime. So I'm elected, I have all the power because I'm elected. I don't have to care about anyone else. And this, in a way, led to the uprisings. And if the uprisings were not severely repressed, I think it would never become that public in the first place in Gezi Park protests. So it was a demonstration, a rightful demonstration, and Erdogan could have actually let it go. And eventually that we wouldn't have the Gezi Park protests and he wouldn't have all the crises that he had. I don't know if he calculated it from all the beginning, but at some point he decided that the Gezi Park protests is not a threat for him, but actually a winner for his popularity, because he could frame the protesters as middle class, secularists, elites, and that's the very logic of populism, as this creating this dilemma between the elites and the masses. So these elites who are middle class, urban, well-to-do, who are safe and secure, are in a way complaining for tiny things. He could have framed it in that way, and he could have, in a way, sold it to his own mass, that the Gezi Park protesters are actually some middle-class urban seculars. This current protest is a bit different because it started with repression. It's not that repression made a small demonstration go out of control. It started with arrest of Imamoglu. It started with repression. It started as a way to dismantle the competitive element of the regime. So it's not that Erdogan acting like, you elected me and I have every right to rule whatever way I fit. That was back 10 years ago, which led to Gezi Park protests. Now he says, you have elected me at one point, and I will make it sure that you will never have a chance to unseat me, unelect me. So this is the difference between Gezi Park protests and the current context that we are having at the moment. And so it's not police brutality that led masses to the streets. Masses went to the streets, and Erdogan is trying to stop it by using police brutality. So again, that's a different dynamic between Gezi Park protests. And it is not, this time, I don't think it is led by middle-class people. It is led by urban youth who feels impoverished, who doesn't see a future, and who is, in a way, very hopeless for their future. And that's why they are on the streets. And that's why, in that sense, it's a more radical movement compared to the Gezi movement. I mean, at the Gezi, people had, as I said, they were middle-class people. They had everything to lose. They wanted the regime to be more receptive to their demands, but as middle classes, they had things to lose. As in this current protest, what we see is that police brutality is actually, so far at least, didn't let people to stop protesting because they feel more desperate compared to Gezi Park protesters. I mean, I was a youngster myself at the Gezi Park era. I was an assistant in a university. I had a luxury life in Turkish standards. I don't think a professor now has the lifestyle that I had as a university assistant at the time of the Gezi protests. So that economic decline, and I don't think any of the current university assistants, any of the graduate students or undergraduate students have a hopeful future in their hand, and that also contributes to their willingness to go to the streets. So in that sense, there are these basic differences, I would say.
Right. What does the sidelining of Imamoglu suggest about the regime's tolerance for political pluralism within the current constitutional framework? What risks do opposition parties face in navigating between electoral participation and resistance, within an increasingly autocratic system?
Well, the opposition parties are now in a dilemma. I've been talking about that competitive element has gone. It's becoming a full authoritarian regime. And I'm sure at some point people would discuss then, okay, why are we, is this a theater? Why are we playing our figurine roles in this performative act of legitimizing Erdogan authoritarianism? Why are we competing at all in the elections? I think that would be a trap that Venezuelan opposition has fell at some point. Whatever happens, I mean, there will be pressure to the opposition to boycott the elections and things like that. I think this would be the wrong way to go. Whatever happens, the opposition has to go to has to stick with the ballot box, has to participate in the elections, and make it sure that everybody knows that they won the elections. I mean, I'm not saying that the regime can be unseated through elections. I think we are passing that threshold. I'm using we are passing, I'm not saying we passed that threshold, it's a process. But even if we pass that threshold at some point and it becomes impossible to unseat the current regime by elections, still opposition should participate in the elections and show that they have the popular majority. But they also have to admit that it won't probably be enough. You can no longer unseat Erdogan by using your votes. You have to mobilize the streets, demonstrations, and raising this popular demand that he should go. They have to combine those both tactics. I mean, win at the ballot box and also sustain the mobilization as well.
Right. And lastly, Professor Cevik, how do you interpret the EU and the US muted response to Imamoglu's arrest? Can this be read as a form of tacit legitimation, geopolitical pragmatism? To what extent does Western inaction amount to green light for Erdogan's continued autocratization?
I think this is a very important question, and thank you for asking this. And as I said in one of the previous questions, Erdogan feels both very weak because he's losing the popular legitimacy, but he's also feeling very strong because he has he has control of the coercive apparatus of the state, but he also has international backing. And when we say international backing, he has the backing of both Americans and Europeans. And we have to talk about this very briefly. Let me say a few words about both. I mean, if Trump talks with Erdogan, probably he would ask for advice for repeating what Erdogan is doing in Turkey and United States. So obviously there would be no backlash coming from the American side. And all democracy movements in the world have to adapt to the fact that America is no longer ruled by a Democrat. I mean, America's own record for democracy has always have been a critical record. It sold out Democrats when it suits its strategic interests, that's sure. But it came to a point where America is ruled by a president who actually admires autocrats more than Democrats. So we've left that out. And for the Europeans, I think Europeans will criticize it, and they do criticize it with weak words and sentences, expression of concern, but nothing will came out of it. And because everybody knows that they don't mean it, because actually they feel that they need Turkey more than ever, because once Trump made it sure that American security guarantees are no longer reliable, Europe is now discussing creating its own strategic autonomy, its own defensive capacities, and Turkey emerged as a very crucial actor here with its strong military, large population, and a growing defense industry. So Turkey, and its strategic location as well. So Turkey is a very important partner potentially for European security, and that's Erdogan knows this and hopes that Europe would ignore his authoritarian move because they need him. And he's so far proven right. But I have to let me finish by saying that it's not only a normative mistake to allow Erdogan with this move, hoping that it's Turkey strategically important, but it's also a strategically blind thinking to allow Erdogan to do that because Turkey will be a big security partner. Because once Erdogan removes all the thresholds between full authoritarianism and himself, once Turkey becomes a Putin-like regime, the question for Europeans should be, can a regime like that be trusted for security cooperation? Can it really be a security partner? Turkish-European relations have been transactional for the last decade, and an authoritarian figure like Erdogan was quite fine for that. Transactionalism allowed for bargaining, and you could prefer to allow with a single individual rather than a state, and that was fine. But once you move beyond that, if you want to create a strategic partnership between Europe and Turkey, if Turkey would be an important part of European security, then you can't really trust to a personalist autocracy with that. Europe did the same mistake with Putin. They hoped that by creating economic interdependencies, Russia will never be a threat to European security, and they proved wrong. I see no reason why Erdogan should be trusted more than Putin in that sense, and why European security should be trusted with a political system that is ruled by the whims of a single individual. And that, as I said, it's not only a normatively wrong, but morally wrong, but it's also very strategically blind thinking for European sides.
Professor Cevik, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.